Welcome everyone to our next interview with John Peel. John will be being interviewed by Reuben Herfindahl.
Okay, how are you doing today, John?
I am doing very well, thank you. This is a lot of fun here.
Yeah, it
Yep.
seems like you've been everywhere this weekend. Anytime you go to a panel, we're honored to have you there.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You know, my notes are a little bit of a mess, but so you've written over 120 books, is that correct?
Somewhere around there.
Somewhere around there.
I keep intending to count them again sometime, but then I think, no, I'll leave it for later.
That's just impressive, and especially when you consider where some of these books come into play. There's some very important books in Doctor Who history that you have been the one to author. The very first New Adventures, which led us into Through the Wilderness Years and directly inspired the new series. That was penned by you. How did that come about?
Well, it came about because I pushed for it really, really hard. What happened was, when I was doing my novelizations of the Dalek stories, I realized we were getting very, very close to the end, and that sooner or later there were going to be new adventures if they chose to go down that path. And every time I talked to my editor, I would say, so have they made any decisions yet about whether we're going to continue it? And he would say mostly, well, we've talked to the BBC, but they really don't know if they want to do original material. But then what happened, of course, was that they said, well, we're not doing any new shows, so you may as well go ahead and do whatever you like, which was really, I mean, that's a bad thing to say to a writer, you know, do whatever you like. But Peter Darvill Evans, who was the editor at the time, decided he was going to launch it as if it was a new season of the show. And he would commission the stories as if he was commissioning, you know, the next actual physical show. And as a result of which, he plotted the outline for doing a 4-episode, if you like, or 4-story arc. But he really didn't quite know exactly where it was going to go. He had a rough idea. And what happened was, every time I got to the point where I was calling him up and saying, are we going to do original? So finally one day he says, well, John, you can stop asking the question. Yes, we are. And would you like, I'm first, right? And he's like, yeah, you're first. So I met Terence Dix a few years back, and I said to Terence, you know, I'm sorry about this, but I pushed so hard to be the first. Really, you should have been the first because you'd done so many Target books and everything. Were you upset when when I jumped in and grabbed first place? And he said, no, I was relieved. He said, because I knew everybody would complain about the first one because it wouldn't be what they wanted. It would be something different. He says, I was happy to do number 2 because they would say, thank God after number 1 we've got a good number 2. So we got along very well with that. But what had happened was Peter had come up with the idea for the Time Worm, except it was a very vague concept. All he had was, it was a Time Lord legend that the Doctor now has to track down. So I thought, oh, good, this is going to be fun. And I immediately, this was, of course, the days before the internet. So the way I actually communicated with Peter was either calling him up, or if he needed to have pages of material from me, I had to go to this local industry who would fax the material that I wrote off to Peter, get a fax when Peter was ready, he would send a fax back to this firm, and I'd have to go and pick it up. So it was quite a process. But I sent Peter this outline for a time worm story where the Doctor accidentally creates the time worm. And it was all about a world where it's ruled by a central computer. And everybody on the planet, whether they knew it or not, were backup floppy disks for the computer, which shows you how old the story is. I mean, the fact that I'm talking about floppy disks. And, you know, that what would happen is the Doctor and Ace arrive, and everybody's normal and everything. And then suddenly they would go into, and stop talking, stop moving, stop everything, because they were now being, parts of their brain were now being used by the time worm. And I thought, wow, this is kind of fun, you know, cutting edge at the time. So I'm thinking, this is really good. And I sent it off to Peter, and then I get this phone call from Peter saying, it's an interesting story, John, but I was actually thinking more of Mesopotamians. And I'm like, which you didn't mention. Oh, I forgot that part, did I? Yeah. Okay, yeah. I want Mesopotamians. He says, have you ever heard of Gilgamesh? And I said, hang on. Pulls books down from bookshelf. Yeah, it's right here in front of me. And he's like, oh, good, I picked the right person then, definitely. So we sat down and he said, yeah, I want Gilgamesh in it. And I was like, okay. So I had to completely scrap the first outline and sit down again and work out a story with Gilgamesh in it. Then came the next problem, because Peter had created this idea of the time worm, but he didn't quite know what he was going to do with it. On the other hand, all 4 books had to be written simultaneously. So it wasn't a matter of me writing the first book and then he could hand it on to Terence. Terence had to write at the same time I was writing. So what I had to do very, very quickly was write chapter 1 of my story, a long description of what the time worm was, and an explanation of how it would end so that they could pick it up from that story. So I did all this, and I sent it all off to him, and he duplicated the whole thing and sent on to Terence and Nigel and Paul Cornell, who were doing the other 3. And then I sat down and wrote my story. And at the same time, all the other 3 were writing their story. And Peter's job, obviously, was then to oversee the whole thing to make sure it was going in the same direction. And I had nothing to do. I had no idea what the other 3 were writing at all beyond the titles.
Wow.
So, you know, I was completely ignorant. And by the time I finished my story, I was kind of like, I've got to hand the time worm over now. I can't write anymore. I can't do what I want to do with the time worm. That's not my character anymore. And that was kind of sad. Yeah. But it was fun. I mean, it was something I'd not quite done before, and it was certainly very enjoyable. But then we had problems because somehow one of the fanzines in England got hold of my outline.
Oh, no.
Now, my outline was very vague because I was writing before I wrote the story. So when I came to write the story, my way of writing, if you like, is like following a road map. I know where the road's going, and I know I've got to get from A to B, and that's the road I'm taking. But I don't know all the details, and I don't know where the nice places to stop off and have lunch are, you know. It's like that. So I write the outline, and then I modify it as I go along. When I discover, oh, this isn't going to work, let me change it to that. And they only had the outline for my original proposal.
The floppy disk one.
And they pretended that they had actually seen the book, which they hadn't. And they printed a very, very unpleasant review of the book because there was no way they could have seen it.
Right.
And this is why we knew where it came from, because it had all the mistakes that I corrected from the outline in the original, into the actual finished book. And they leaked all of this to fandom in advance, which was kind of, because it was so negative, it created a bad atmosphere before the book even began.
Doctor Who fans reviewing things before they've been seen and coming up with a negative idea? I'd say that seems like a very novel idea.
Yeah.
So jumping forward a little bit, you were also the second person to author in the new Missing Adventures range, and the first one that was not a crossover from the New Adventures.
Right.
And one of the things I thought that was quite interesting about that is in the start of the book, you have a very long thank you list specifically to the Visions Convention, with some of the names on there being very familiar to our fandom up here. What was the reasoning behind the thank you? Was that ideas discussed at the convention that came up for that? This was for, it's at the tip of my tongue, the novel. I just read it this week too. Sorry about that. It's out of my head. The second Missing Adventures novel. The
Victorian Evolution.
Yeah. Yes, Evolution. Thank you.
Evolution. Yeah. I don't remember.
Okay, that's fine.
No. I don't actually remember it even being in there. But at the time, we were doing the Visions in Chicago, and I'd been a guest like 3 years in a row or something, and they treated me very nicely, and I got to meet a lot of the cast and everything.
Okay.
Which is why the Time Worm Genesis, my editor said to me, wouldn't it be nice if we could get someone really famous to do a good introduction to this? And I said, who did you have in mind? And he said, oh, I don't know, who would you like? And I was going to go to Visions, and there was Sophie and Sylvester were both going to be guests. So I'm like, Sophie, Sylvester, Sophie. And I thought, Sophie. I'll ask Sophie. And she's a sweetheart. I mean, I'm sure you've all probably seen her, right? Sophie is an absolute doll. She's a love. So I said to her, will you please write the introduction to my novel? And she's like, yeah, sure, John, no problem. So when I was doing Evolution, one of the guests at the Chicago Visions was going to be Liz Slayton. Sure. So that was nice, and that was the first time I met Liz. Actually, it was the only time I met Liz, I think. And I went up to Liz at the convention, and I said, I'm doing a Tom Baker Sarah story. And she's like, oh, good, I'm pleased to hear that, lovely. What's it about? And I tell her a little bit about the story. And I said, and Sarah gets to meet her literary hero, and she looks at me and she says, who is it? And I said, well, it's someone very logical, I think. It's because Sarah is a journalist who then becomes a novelist. And I said, so her hero is a journalist who becomes a novelist. It's Rudyard Kipling. And she's like, oh, thank God, John, for making it somebody sensible. She had been afraid that it might be some idiot thing. But I didn't tell her that it was a juvenile Rudyard Kipling, who's a randy little idiot. But whatever. But I was like going back and forth between Visions conventions at the time, so that's obviously why I wrote the long thank you, because they were helping me get the people I needed to talk to.
Sure.
Which was good. In fact, one of my highlights of my writing career had nothing to do with that. It was at a Visions convention. I was writing Power of the Daleks. And I had just started writing it. And Colin Baker was going to be the main guest at this convention. And I had an idea, and I went to Colin, and I said, Colin, would you read, I'm going to be doing a reading from Power of the Daleks. Would you read a little bit of it with me? And he's like, yeah, sure, John, why not? What do you want me to do? And I said, well, I'm going to do the very first regeneration sequence. Would you read Pat Troughton's lines for me? And it was amazing. I start reading it, and Colin comes out. When the applause dies down, of course, he reads the little bit which leads up to Ben saying, who are you? And then the Doctor, I am the Doctor. And of course, Colin's brought the house down. Absolutely lovely. Colin was just wonderful with that. And it was so kind of him to do this. But he thought it would be a great treat for the fans, and that was what mattered.
That's amazing.
So we had a good relationship with Visions at the time, and I was having great fun with it.
Well, that's great. One of the things you mentioned earlier, you had some fan criticism, and it goes with the territory, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And way before Stephen Moffat blew up the internet with his redesigned Daleks, you blew up the news groups with the introduction of the Spider Dalek in War of the Daleks. And you can still Google it today, and there's thousands of designs out there.
Yeah.
What was some of the reasoning behind the Spider Dalek? And then what did you think of the fan criticism or compliments?
Well, what happened was I'm friends with a gentleman called Jean-Marc Lefessier, who's a French Doctor Who fan, and he had done a book called, he was doing a book, planning to do a book called The Nth Doctor, talking about the unproduced projects.
Yep.
And as a result of which, he said, did you know about the Spider Daleks, which were planned for the TV movie? And I was, no, tell me about them. So he sent me the designs that were originally put forward to be in the TV movie before they decided they weren't going to show the Daleks. And I loved them. The spider designs were great. So I said, well, if they didn't use them in the movie, I'll use them. And that provoked me to think, well, if spider Daleks, what about other kinds of Daleks? The Dalek doesn't need to be the one design. That's a convenient design, but it's not the only design they could be. So I decided to do a whole range of different Daleks specialties. And I talked this over with Terry Nation, and Terry's like, oh, this is good, I like this. Let everybody think I created them. Because I mean, Terry was lovely to work with. Terry was an amazing guy, very, very uncaring about his being credited for things. But at the same time, he was quite willing to take, to say, yeah, I did this, I did that.
Sure.
But he was very open with me and would let me do whatever I liked. But he liked the idea of all of these different Dalek designs and what have you for War of the Daleks.
Yep.
And we got along fantastically well. It was lovely working with Terry.
So can you take us back a little bit and talk about how you first got to meet Terry Nation and how you got to work together on so many projects?
Oh, well, it was one of these absolute accidents that you don't plan and it just happens. I got a call one day from an editor at St. Martin's Press, and this was when the Doctor Who show was starting to take off over here, and he decided it was about time that St. Martin's might make some money off Doctor Who if he could get the right project. So he said to me, we'd love to do a Doctor Who tie-in book, but obviously we can't do the novels because they're tied down, but we can do a factual book. So I've got a few proposals, but I don't know the show. So if I run them past you, can you tell me which of these you think will work? And he ran them past me, and they were dreadful. I mean, they were really amateur concepts.
Sure.
And they would not have worked. You couldn't do them as a book. I mean, one of the proposals was why Tom Baker is the greatest actor ever. I mean, like, well, I think you will annoy all the John Pertwee fans if you try doing that one, you know, and things like this. And at the end of it, he said, well, yeah, all right, I see, none of these are going to work. Do you have any idea that might work? And I said, well, funnily enough, Terry Nation wrote this book back in the 60s called The Dalek Pocketbook. And I said, you know, I haven't read it recently, but I've got a copy of it, and sure. I think if it's updated, that might work. And he said to me, okay, good, yeah. Can you ask Terry if you'd do it? I'm like, yeah, I guess I can try. But I mean, I'd never met Terry. I didn't know him anything, where he was or anything. But I did know there was a Blake 7 fan club, in fact, here in Chicago, in the Chicago area. And I contacted the woman who ran it, and I said, you know, can you put me in touch with Terry? And sure. She was like, well, I'll give him your phone number, but I'm not guaranteeing anything because Terry does what Terry wants. Yeah. So she gave him my phone number, and I got this phone call one day. Hello, John, this is Terry Nation. And we started having a chat, and I said, you know, do you think we could update you could update your book? And I've got a guaranteed sale here for you from St. Martin's Press. Yeah. And Terry says, oh, I love that idea, but I haven't got the time to do it. He says, would you like to do it? I'm like, yeah, would I like to work with you? Yes, yeah, I can do it. So then I actually gave the book a really good look and realized I couldn't update it because it really was a product of the 60s and it wouldn't work in the 80s. So I said, you know, to Terry, well, I think what we need is a completely brand new book talking about the Daleks. And he's like, well, I haven't got the time. I'm working on MacGyver. I haven't got time to do that. Will you write it and put my name on it as well? So I was like, oh, okay, yeah. I mean, it will help sell the book. Why not? You know, Terry Nation and John Peel. Yeah, because nobody would know who I was. I hadn't written any books at that point. Well, I'd written a book, but it was in the process of going through editing. Sure. So what happened was we eventually got arranged, we got this book, the official Doctor Who and the Daleks book, set up. And we were going to do that. Now, when Terry had moved over here from England, he's a bit of a pack rat. And he kept all of his papers and all of his scripts and everything. And he put them all in these large packing cases and mailed them over, shipped them overseas to his home in California. And then when it had arrived, of course, he was busy. He'd arrived before they did, and he was busy. So he just told them, put them in the garage. Sure. So they stuck all these boxes in his garage. And what happened then was he would say to his poor wife, Kate, go in the thing, look in the boxes, find anything that's marked Dalek, and mail it to John. So I never knew what I was getting. I would get a package marked, you know, John, open it up, and it could be anything. Because Kate didn't know what I needed, and Terry didn't have the time to go hunting for himself. So I got all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. And it was a great time. So we're working on this book together, which was quite fun. And then W.H. Allen called him up. Actually, no, at that point it was still Target, I think, not W.H. Allen. But Target called him up, which they were doing on a regular basis, saying, please, can we have another Doctor Who and the Daleks book? Sure. And he always said no, because he hadn't been very happy with what they'd been doing with the last couple of his books. So he said no all the time. But by the time we were working on this book together, he suddenly stopped and said, okay, I'll tell you what. You can have another Dalek one as long as John Peel writes it. And, Target were like, anything with the Daleks on it, doubles sales immediately. We don't care who writes it, as long as it's got a Dalek on it, it's going to sell. So they said, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, John can do it. Who's John? But, John can do it. So the first thing I knew about it was when Terry called me up and said, John, would you like to do a Dalek book? And I said, we're doing a Dalek book. No, he says, a novel. Would you like to novelize the next Dalek script? Would I like to novelize that? Yeah. It's like asking a drunk if they want to drink, And of course I said, yes, yeah, I'd love to. Why? He says, well, I've already arranged it for you. I'm glad you said yes.
Did you, you talked about his archive material. So when you were preparing some of the books, for example, Master Plan, did you have some of his source outlines or scripts from that?
Well, it was poor old Kate again. Kate, I need anything that's marked Dalek Master Plan. Send it to John. So poor old Kate has to go out to the garage, pull out anything that's got Master Plan written on it, and mail it to me.
Okay.
So the first thing I got was this big package, like about this thick. And I open it up, and it's not the scripts, which I was expecting.
Right.
It's actually all the production notes from making the show. And it's the art department complaining that their budget's been cut by £3, 10 shillings and sixpence.
Oh.
And somebody writing saying, so-and-so said this at a meeting, and I think that's very insulting, and all this kind of really internal documents that nobody outside the BBC is supposed to see. And,
Sure.
And she's just sent them to me because she didn't know any better, poor girl. Why would she? And so I had to call Terry and say, these are really fascinating, and I love them, but they're not the scripts.
Yeah.
So then she had to go hunting again and find the real scripts, and I got them in the next package.
So you did get some scripts, because we've had conflicting information from different people that worked on the show at the time,
Yeah.
saying a little bit that he phoned in Master Plan, gave him a 2-page outline. So there were actually full scripts, and that's that.
Oh yeah. He'd written a full outline breakdown, which, when I say a full outline okay, Terry wrote 2 pages, and most of it's whatever happens in episode 1, and then he says, and then the story goes on, and that's his outline.
Okay.
Because of course he knew they wanted the story, and they didn't care particularly what it was as long as they could film it.
Sure.
So his outlines are very vague.
Okay. That
Yeah.
makes sense there. So.
Yeah.
You're currently working on a couple of different Who-related ranges.
Mm-hmm.
One with the Lethbridge Stewart.
Yeah.
And I understand you're working on one right now that's coming out?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, what happened was a few years back, the editor, Andy, called me up and said, John, we've got the right to use Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart in a series of novels. Would you be interested in writing one of them? And I thought about it and going, I've never written anything set during the Pertwee era at all. I never have somehow. It never came about. And I've never used the Brigadier as a character. Yeah, I'd love to do a Brigadier story. That would be brilliant. So they recruited me to fill in one of the early stories. And since then, every now and again, when they have a hole that they need to fill in their production schedule, they'll say, oh, maybe we should have John write another story. And so I'll get a call from them saying, John, can you write a Lethbridge Stewart story that does this? And it's a good, they're nice folk, and it's a good series. So every time they ask me, I always say yes.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the funniest things is that I've done the first half of a 2-part story, which is it's an independent story, but it's linked into the next book, which will be the final Lethbridge Stewart story. And the author of the final book is John Blum, And John and I have a very mixed history going back of completely disagreeing with one another on everything. So it was kind of funny to find myself working where I'm doing a book that will carry on into his book. And surprisingly enough, we got along tremendously well. And we had a really good time about it.
Great.
And John kept saying, you know, people are not going to believe that you and I are even talking to each other civilly, let alone writing a book, you know, 2 books that are independent.
Sure.
But that was fun. And then they told me that the line was finishing, and these would be the last 2 books in the series. And then they told me why it was finishing was because they had actually finally got the rights to use UNIT. And in fact, not only did they have the rights to use UNIT, they had John Levine aboard. And the very first thing they wanted to do was to do an audio version of a short story read by John.
Okay.
And they said, well, would you like to write the story? Would I like to write a story that John Levine's going to read? Yes, of course I'd like to write the story. And I thought, well, you know, they mentioned in the show at one point, I think in 5 Doctors, that Benton had retired and become a used car salesperson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought, well, there's no hint of that ever in the series, that he liked used cars. But I thought, you know, maybe I can do a story based around that. So I actually wrote this short story, which has Benton demonstrating his knowledge of cars, so that it kind of fits in with him later becoming a car salesperson, because he loves cars. And it was one of those things where I was just going, what can we do that's out of the ordinary? And that's the one thing that's always a problem, of course, in alien invasions is they're always so powerful, and the Doctor has to come up with some sneaky way of beating them. So I thought, what about if I have UNIT fighting an alien that's totally useless and a complete, utter failure? And I created these aliens that, when they get frustrated, their brains literally explode. And John got the script, you know, got the story, and apparently he loved it. He cracked up reading the story, and he's like, yeah, I've got to record this one. He said, aliens with exploding brains. Yeah, I got to do this. So he had fun doing that.
Yeah, that sounds like a good time there. Let's put a hypothetical out here. Let's say you get stuck on an elevator with Russell T. Davies, and he says, I want to bring back a classic series monster. Which monster should it be?
Which one should it be?
And if it's not the Vord, why not, and why are you wrong?
If I had to do a classic series monster for the modern age, I think I'd probably pick the Zarbi. But no, the reason being, after the Daleks, the Zarbi were the most popular childhood monsters. They were incredibly impractical, and they looked like guys wearing ant costumes with big lace-up boots, because that's what they were.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you're a child, and when I was watching this, I was 10 years old, you don't care about these things. What you see is what the scripts tell you, which is these are giant monster ants. So, you know, okay, they've got boots on, but who cares? You know, they're ants. That's what they are. So every kid loved them. I mean, which kid doesn't like the idea of giant, you know, mutant ants running around, you know? So I think I'd probably go with them. And the only thing is, I'm not quite sure what I would do with them. But I mean, I would definitely like to do something.
Yeah,
that would be fun.
Difficult one to revisit, though.
I'm sorry?
If you had a chance to do another Missing Adventure with any Doctor, who would you choose to write that for?
I'd probably go for John Pertwee, because I never got to do him. When I was doing Evolution, my original outline for Evolution which ended up being the Fourth Doctor and Sarah, was to start the story as a third Doctor and Sarah, and then the first half of the book will be the third Doctor with Sarah, and then the second half will be Sarah with the Fourth Doctor.
Okay.
At the time, Peter said, no, we're not doing any multiple Doctor stories. Carefully not telling me that he already commissioned one from Terrence Dicks. But he told me, no, you pick a Doctor, stick with him. So I ended up doing the Fourth Doctor and Sarah, which is honestly my all-time favorite pairing of Doctor and companion. I just thought they were wonderful. I always say that my favorite Doctor is Hartnell because he was my Doctor, but sure. When it came to the team-up, it had to be the Doctor and Sarah, the Fourth Doctor Sarah, because they were just the perfect couple, the pairing and everything. And of course, at the time, I couldn't choose any of the modern Doctors because they didn't exist.
Sure.
But for me, for my money, they were the best. So I'd love to do a third Doctor, because I love John Pertwee and the Pertwee era. So that would be my choice for him, yeah.
Okay. Maybe if anyone has any questions, we could open up to the audience a little bit, whether there's some online questions or if anyone had some questions.
Otherwise, I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, we can get back with that. So you famously brought Skaro back after Skaro had been destroyed.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, what happened was I was feeling kind of happy about the whole business, working with Terry, and Terry allowing me to do, to do the novelizations. So I thought, I want to send an outline into John Nathan Turner for a story. And obviously, it would have to be a Dalek story. And I sat down and wrote a four-episode outline called War of the Daleks, which would bring Skaro back. And I just wrote it as an outline, and I was going to send it off to JNT, and see what he thought of it. And I thought, well, I'll run it past Terry first, obviously, to see what he thinks of it. And as I'm about to do this, I get a phone call from Terry. And Terry has just seen Remembrance. And he is furious, absolutely furious. I've never heard him like this in my life. Because usually, Terry was the most genial, outgoing, easygoing person you can imagine. He really was. Absolute sweetheart with everybody. There was only one thing that ever got him angry, and that was when a producer screwed up something. Screwed up one of his scripts. Not even just a script, but misunderstanding what he's talking about. He was furious, for example, when with the final season of Survivors, because the final season was centered all around getting the power turned back on in England. Yep. And he said, that's not what Survivors was about. Survivors was not about getting the power back. The Survivors was, what don't we know about how to really live that could kill us? He said he had realized at one point that nobody nowadays knows how to make various things. They might be able to grow a few plants, but they don't know much else. And he was thinking, what if somebody gets sick and there's no doctors? This kind of thing. And that was what he wanted Survivors to be about. How do normal people, average people, cope with a situation that's beyond their experience when they've suddenly got to rely on experts that aren't there anymore? So he had explained this all very carefully to me, that this was really the only thing that he objected to. And then when he saw Remembrance of the Daleks, where they blew up Skaro, he was like, no, that's not, they should not have done that. Yes. They should never have done this. And he was furious, and he said, that man, meaning JNT, that man will never have the Daleks again. So I look at this outline of mine for the Dalek script that I'm going to send to JNT and put it in the file, forget about it. And then when BBC Books took over the Doctor Who series, they called me up and said, John, will you write as a Dalek book? Anything, any novel, anything you want, just write it for us. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, I've got the War of the Daleks hanging around. So I pull out the thing and send them the outline, and they loved it. And then I finally sent it to Terry, who was happy, and I said, is it okay to do this? And Terry said, well, there's only one thing I want you to do. Promise me you'll bring back Skaro. And I said, well, read the outline, you'll see, because I do that. So he's like, okay, anything else you want, you're doing what I want. And we had some really nice long chats about the plot for War. And if you read War of the Daleks, you can see it's broken down into 4 sections. And they were the original 4-episode outlines that I wrote. So you can, I left it in there. So if you really want to, you can go back and say, this would have been episode 1, this would have been episode 2, and so on and so forth. Terry was very happy. Terry, especially what Terry liked about War of the Daleks was that I had made the Thals start down the path to becoming the Daleks themselves, and not realizing it. And Terry said, yes, that's the big problem with facing any kind of evil enemy. You've got to make sure you don't become what it is you hate. And because he'd grown up, I think I said it at this panel, maybe it was a different one, but he'd grown up during World War II. And his big evil, of course, were Nazis. And he said to me that the worst thing that he knew about was when the Allies mass-bombed Dresden. I mean, leveled the city, basically, with fire bombs, killed thousands of people, innocent people. And he said, we were supposed to be the good guys. Yeah. And he said, how can you tell us from them if we do the same things? So when I did this with the Thals turning into the Daleks, he was like, yes, you've got the whole, this is what I worry about. This is the kind of thing that we become evil when we fight evil if we're not careful. So he loved that. That was something he absolutely loved. Because Terry wanted people to get that message very strongly. It was so important to him, that when you fight evil, you don't use evil methods. Which is why he liked the Doctor, because the Doctor always tried to come up with a relatively benign solution, even when it wasn't possible with the Daleks. He still tried it. As in that famous scene from Genesis where he's arguing, do I have the right to destroy them? That was what Terry was worrying. That was the same thing. Do you become, murdering scum like the Daleks to destroy the Daleks? Yeah. So we saw eye to eye. That's why he was always ready to let me do things, because I could understand what where Terry was coming from and what he was trying to do, and he trusted me to do this too, because he knew I would do that.
And then you followed it up with another return, following up on the Dalek invasion of Earth and Susan.
Yeah. There's a very funny story about that one, actually. After War of the Daleks, which BBC Books loved, they said, would you write us another one? Would you do another Dalek story? So I said, sure, yeah, and they said, anything you like, don't worry, go with whatever you want. And I had written a fan fiction story called Legacy of the Daleks for the British fanzine Cosmic Mask. And I'd liked it, because what I always wondered was, when Susan's left behind on Earth as a time lady, she's married to David Campbell, but David is a human. They will age at very different rates. So what happens? Because David is going to die before her. There's no question about that. And I started writing Legacy of the Daleks from that point of view. What became of Susan 30, 40, 50 years after Dalek invasion? She's married, she's had children even maybe, but she still looks 17. And she has to, wear makeup to make herself look older, not younger.
Yeah.
She has to look, make it look like she's in her 50s or 60s. And I like this concept. So, and I wrote the book, and then at the end of it, I put in a little note saying, this story began life as a fan fiction story. And everything, and I told the story about how I'd written this originally as fan fiction. Yep. So my editor at that point, I forget who it was, I can't remember, but my editor called me up in horror, and he said, John, please tell me, can I cut that end, your explanation at the end about it being a fan fiction story? Because what will happen is, as soon as any fan sees that little line, they'll say, oh, maybe I can sell them my fan fiction story. And he says, I'm going to be flooded with fan fiction. He said, so don't mention that, otherwise I'm going to be in real trouble here, and I shall be very annoyed with you. So we cut that bit of the acknowledgments.
Well, you were involved in early Doctor Who fandom with writing for some of the fanzines, and then onto some of the more professional ones.
Yeah. Well, that I don't look down on my down at fan fiction. I really don't. I think fan fiction is a wonderful thing. It's where I learn my craft. Because when you're writing fan fiction, to do it properly, you have to recreate the characters and the setting that you're writing for. And to me, it was always very important to get the tone right. And it taught me to do that by saying, well, I'm writing a Tom Baker story, or I'm writing a Patrick Troughton story, and you have to change the way you do things from each Doctor. And I always felt, and I still feel, that fan fiction is a very good place for would-be authors to start, because you have to take someone else's concepts and work your way into them. So I was very involved in early fan fiction with other writers. Sure. One of which actually was Stephen Baxter, who is now a very well-known science fiction author in England. And he started out writing short stories for me, which is kind of cool, thinking, oh yeah, that's where he started. That's amazing. It's cool. And I don't look down my nose at fan fiction. I think fan fiction, when it's done properly, can be very good. I mean, when it's done badly, it's like anything else that's done badly. It's terrible. But, maybe 90% of it isn't good or isn't great, but there's 10% there that has a lot of real potential.
Sure.
And, I did my best to try and encourage it. And I always hoped I was in that 10% anyway.
So did you make the leap from doing the fanzines and the fan fiction? Was doing the backup scripts for Doctor Who magazine, was that your first real move into that?
Well, that's what I did. We were doing, these were early days in fandom, and the second convention, Des Skin announced that he was doing this new weekly magazine called Doctor Who Weekly, and that it would be articles and also fiction, comic strips. So I cornered him after the convention and said, I've got some ideas for comic strips, which I hadn't. But I had ideas, so I thought they could become comic strips. And he said, okay, John, yeah, send them to me. So we'll check it, we'll look at them. And he did. It was one of those cases where he said, send them to me, I'll read them. And he really did read them. And he liked one of the outlines, which I did with the Celestial Toymaker, who'd been one of my all-time favorite villains. Yeah. And he said, develop this into a short story for me, and we'll make it a comic strip. And I was like, okay, yeah, great, this is fantastic. And I did this, And he assigned it to one of the best comic artists in England. And when I got this comic strip, I was blown away. I mean, it was, when you're writing, you picture, for me at least, my writing is, I've got a little mental television and I'm watching the pictures on it and I'm writing down what I'm seeing, kind of thing. So I have a vision in it of what my story looks like. But of course, when the artist gets this outline, he's just got words. So he looks at it and he's got his own mental image of what it looks like. So it was always exciting for me to send in the script and then see how it came into the artist's mind, how they saw it. And it was fantastic. Trust me, the first time I got the pages from my story, my very first comic strip, on the very first pages, I was in heaven. It was just gorgeous stuff. And the artist caught everything that I wanted. He did everything exactly the way I wanted it, but better. It was better than my imagination because he knew what he was doing. He was a professional, consummate professional, in fact. And it was, I mean, I had other strips done, but never that same thrill.
Right.
They were very happy. I was very happy with them, but that first one was just magnificent. It was just because it was the first, I think, half of it. It was, and also because the artist was just so good. But that was simply because I'd fall in my career. I've fallen into things by accident that had taken me where I really wanted to go if I had been thinking about going there.
Sure.
I got to do with Terry Nation, and I would never, of my own account, ever thought I've got to contact Terry and talk to him. I would have never done that, but I was forced to do it. And I would never have said to Terry, "Oh, I'd love to novelize one of your Dalek stories." It would never occur to me. But when he said, "I want John to do it," of course, yeah, lovely. And that happened time after time to me, which was marvelous, that I was actually offered the chance to do something I would never have had the nerve to ask for. So I've been very, very fortunate.
And then you had some of your fanzine work ended up being guides to seasons of Doctor Who, published later, or am I misremembering?
I'm sorry. I didn't quite catch that. I'm a little hard of hearing. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was just talking a little bit more about your fanzine work and how you wrote articles and you edited.
Yes, Cosmic Mask.
Cosmic Mask, yes.
That again was me being very arrogant and unthinking. When I joined Doctor Who Appreciation Society in its very early days, they had a magazine called TARDIS, and they put a couple of short stories in there, short fanzine stories, which were of the, oh my God, I can't believe how awful these stories are kind of variety. And I wrote to the editor saying, "These stories are crap. Can't you do any better?" And the editor wrote back to me saying, "Can you?" So I was like, I turned to my friend Stephen Evans, who at the time we were working together, and I said to Stephen, "Let's write some stories to show we can do better." So we sat down and wrote, I don't know, 5 or 6 stories separately. We didn't write together. We wrote in the same room, but we didn't write together. So we did these stories, and then we sent them off to him. And Gordon Blows, who was the editor, said, "Wow, I love these stories. I'll put out a special magazine with them in it." And he did, called Cosmic Mask. And it was very well received in the fan club, in the fan circles. So he said, maybe we should go on and do this as a permanent feature. Keep going with it, and have other people come into the story, into the thing. And will you run it, John? Well, John and Stephen, it was.
Yeah.
And we said, okay, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And we did. We started doing it. My friend Stephen was one of those people whose enthusiasm goes up like a rocket and then... So after about 2 months of this, he was like, I'm out of here. I'm sick of this. And he left, and that was it. So I was left doing it myself. So I was in a position where I was getting stories in from the writers and then having to critique them and decide which ones would work, which ones would not work. And, you know, and as I say, I ended up doing a few issues of Cosmic Mask. And Stephen Baxter was one of the people who wrote a couple of stories for me, and I loved his writing. And then he actually, as I say, he's turned into a very good professional.
Yeah.
Which doesn't surprise me in the slightest, because even in his fan fiction days, he was really good. I mean, he was absolutely excellent. So I ended up helping a few people, I think, which was fun.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So, does anyone else have any questions? We're running a little short on time here.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch. As I said,
I
I'm a
can
little
start
hard
again
of
if you
hearing,
want.
so.
Well, it helps with the microphone is on too.
Oh, yeah, that
Thank you.
helps. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, when you mentioned wanting to do stories from the John Pertwee era, have you had any discussions with Big Finish about doing anything? I know they've done one adaptation of one of your Avengers books.
Oh, the Avengers book, yeah.
Have there been any conversations about doing some of your stories on audio with Big Finish?
For a Big Finish with John Pertwee?
Oh, Big Finish.
Yeah, he was wondering if you'd had any discussions with Big Finish about possibly doing some Doctor Who or John Pertwee related.
Okay, if I.
He was just wondering. He said you'd done Big Finish had done your Avengers, and
Yeah.
he was wondering if there was anything on the Doctor Who front, possibly with John Pertwee, that you had ever talked to Big Finish about.
Yeah, I'm actually meeting Jason, who's the head of Big Finish, next month. But it's one of those things where we've never quite clicked on to working together, so I don't know. Maybe we will. He and I have been talking about some of the Dalek projects, and I don't know whether it's ever going to come off, so I don't really want to start rumors going about it, but we may be doing something which will be interesting. And it will involve the Daleks. So that is as far as I'll go, because I'm not going to start spreading rumors that may or may not ever happen. I don't talk about work unless I've finished it or very nearly finished it, because so much in this world is so impermanent, and although it may look in really good shape at the minute, it may actually all bottom out and die before we get there. So keep your fingers crossed, I might have some good news.
Well, that seems like a good place to wrap it up with a little bit of a Doctor Who type cliffhanger here with what comes next. So I'd like everyone to thank the one and only John Peel. Thanks so much.
Thank you.